Casa Cornelia Law Center welcomes the board and staff members, volunteer attorneys, and interpreters to the introduction of Cornelia Conley, for whom the Law Center is named. This short video offers a glimpse into Cornelia's early life. Her formative years and choices reveal the values of adaptation, mercy, and zeal that inspire Casa Cornelia today.
This is the story of the first half of Cornelia Conley's life, the first 34 of her 70 years. It's about the people, events, and places that especially shaped her as a woman of extraordinary faith and love, a gifted educator, a person intent on responding to the needs of her time and place with mercy and compassion.
From the beginning, Cornelia's large family was very important to her. Her parents were Ralph Peacock and Mary Bowen, who had been widowed at a young age in a previous marriage. So Cornelia's immediate family included a half-brother, a half-sister, and 5 more siblings. Born on January 15, 1809 in Philadelphia, she had the distinction of being the youngest of the 8. Her family home was downtown in the fashionable heart of the city, at a time when Philadelphia was a sophisticated cultural center and former capital of the new country, which was then only 33 years old.
We don't know much about Cornelia's education, but she seems to have received a good one at home, probably from her mother and other tutors, which would have been typical of her time. In the religion of servants, the family worshiped at the Presbyterian Church. Whatever may have been the peace and stability of her early home life, Cornelia's world was turned upside down again and again between the ages of 9 and 14. When she was just 9 years old, her father died at the age of 50. 4 years later, her oldest brother died at the age of 23, when Cornelia was a young teenager, just 13. And in the very next year, when she was 14, Cornelia lost her mother. Shortly after her mother's death, the family house was sold and the children went to live in separate places. Cornelia was taken to the home of her half-sister Isabella Montgomery, where she lived for 8 years, all through her teens and into her early 20s. So, from the day of her childhood, she was well acquainted with loss and grief, as well as the sustaining power of strong family bonds.
Isabella and her husband were good to Cornelia. They were wealthy, childless, and able to continue her good education with many cultural advantages. As a family, they worship in the Episcopal Church, so Cornelia joined them and sang in the choir. Eventually, she was baptized in that church, and there she met her future husband, Pierce Connolly, who was a young minister. In 1831, at the age of 22, Cornelia decided to marry Pierce, although her half-sister objected strenuously. We don't know exactly why Isabella was so opposed to the marriage, but Cornelia went ahead and married Pierce against her wishes.
With her marriage to Pierce at the age of 22, Cornelia moved into a new stage of young adulthood, a time marked by significant physical and spiritual journeys, and of giving herself fully to being a wife and mother.
Pierce, the man Cornelia loved, was a complex person. The oldest of 4 brothers and not well liked by them. He also had a difficult relationship with his mother, and they were eventually estranged from each other. As a young minister, he had applied to be a rector of a church in Boston, but he was turned down. And that's what led him to the church in Natchez, Mississippi, where the Connellys went immediately as newlyweds. The journey from Philadelphia to Natchez in wintertime was long and hard. It took 6 days for them to reach Pittsburgh by horse-drawn coach. There, they boarded a steamboat and went the rest of the way by water, first on the Ohio River, then on the Mississippi, a dangerous journey of 9 days, and the first of many more perilous journeys to come.
Natchez, at that time, was a commercial center for the South. It was also a crossroad for travelers, merchants, and explorers. Many wealthy landowners had their beautiful homes there, with huge plantations that ran along the banks of the Mississippi River for miles and miles. Within a year of arriving in Natchez, Pierce and Cornelia bought their own home, which they named White Cottage. It was a fairly modest house compared to the big homes of the wealthy planners, but very nice. And they settled in it just in time for the birth of their first child, Mercer, who they called Murdy. The Conleys had really entered a new culture as a young couple, the culture of the Deep South, very different from what was familiar to them in Philadelphia. Not only were they engaged in an intercultural experience, but they were also adapting to their life as a newly married couple, becoming parents, and meeting the challenges of Pierce's new ministry, all within the span of 4 years. They arrived there in 1831. Murty was born in 1832, and their daughter Addie in 1835.
Oh Lord, waiting on you. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Can't do nothing until you come.
While they were finding their way in all of this newness, the religious atmosphere in Natchez began to change notably. An anti-Catholic movement was gaining force, due to mainly to a major wave of immigration in the early part of the 19th century. People were leaving Europe in great numbers and coming to the US in search of a better life and greater freedom. A large number of these immigrants were Catholics, so the Catholic population was growing rapidly. They were seen as a threat to the US citizens because they looked for jobs wherever they could get them, and there was great fear that they would take jobs away from the settled people. A cry that's familiar to us today.
Where did you come from? Knock a fella down. Where did you come from? Knock a fella down.
So, resistance to immigrants turned into aggression towards Catholics, and the evangelical and other Protestant groups began to organize in protest against the Catholic Church, spreading hatred and lies about the church and eventually committing acts of violence to stir up fear in the people. As a minister in the Protestant church, Pierce was aware of this development and deeply concerned about it. As the attacks against the Catholic Church increased, he began to have doubts about his own Episcopal Church, which was also engaged in the anti-Catholic movement. Eventually, he concluded that he could not continue as a minister in the Episcopal Church, so he took the bold step of resigning from his position as rector. During his search, Pierce met with the Catholic bishop of the region and asked if he could become a Catholic priest. The bishop replied that it would be impossible while his wife was alive. Even so, Pierce and Cornelia began to study Catholicism to try to understand it better and decide if they should embrace it for themselves.
And so by 1835, just 4 years after their marriage, Pierce was without a paying job, father of 2 young children, and in search of the truth of his faith. And Cornelia, as we know, joined him in the search, and together they arrived at the decision to ask to be received into the Catholic Church. So they said their goodbyes to Natchez, but not without pushback from family. Both the Peacock and Conley families were upset by the decision, although friends in Natchez supported Pierce with their respect and friendship, and the parishioners were sorry to see him go. Because Pierce wanted to go right to Rome to experience the church at its center, the Conleys sold their house and furnishings and made plans to set sail for Rome from New Orleans. Cornelia was 26 and Pierce was 31, when they went by riverboat to New Orleans in November 1835. By some standards, they had done a very foolish thing, leaving the security of their life and livelihood in Natchez. On the other hand, they were on a quest for the truth. They were willing to risk everything for the sake of knowing and embracing the truth as fully as they could. And they had each other's support and enthusiasm in the search.
And so, they arrived in New Orleans, which was a very French and very Catholic city. They had contacts there and were invited to the ordination of the new bishop in St. Louis Cathedral. This was Cornelia's first participation in a Catholic Mass, and she was very moved by it. So, while they were waiting for a ship to take them to Europe, Cornelius began instruction in the Catholic faith, and she decided to ask to be received into the church before going to Rome, where Pierce wanted to wait until he had resolved all his doubts. On December 11, they set sail on a ship bound for Marseille and began their 40-day journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Once again, it was in the cold of winter, on the high seas. Pierce, Cornelia, 3-year-old Muddy, 8-month-old Addie, and Phoebe, their maid. After a break of 3 weeks, they will go by another ship and coach to Rome. Altogether, it was a 2-month journey in the winter time, very long and very hard.
Rome delighted them immediately. They were thrilled to be there and were very quickly caught up in an admiring circle of clergy, hierarchy, and aristocratic Catholics. The Conleys thoroughly enjoyed every aspect of their 2-year stay in Europe, spiritually, socially, culturally, and they made many wonderful friends. Within a short time, Pierce renounced his Episcopal faith and formally became a Catholic, and both he and Cornelia were confirmed. Cornelia had reason to think that Pierce had let go of the idea of ordination, but in fact he hadn't, and he continued to pursue it with all the influential churchmen he came in contact with, including the Pope. Realizing that he continued to hope that he'd find a pathway toward Catholic priesthood caused Cornelia immense anxiety and torment. A distinguished English layman invited Pierce to visit England while they were in Europe, with the hope that Pierce, as a Catholic layman, could be very helpful among English Catholics during a time of Catholic restoration. So Cornelia stayed quietly in Rome during the 4 months that Pierce was away. It was a time when her inner life was being nourished and growing strong for whatever lay ahead for them.
No sooner had Pierce returned to Rome from England than the Cornelius learned of a financial crisis in the US, and this meant they needed to return home to look after their own finances. Cornelia was pregnant with their 3rd child by then, and they made their way up through northern Italy into Austria, where John Henry was born in Vienna in June 1837. They weren't able to get a ship for the US until November, so they had another long crossing of the Atlantic in early winter. The ship reached New Orleans in January 1838, and they traveled up the Mississippi back to Natchez, this time with 3 children, the youngest just 6 months old. Pierce needed work in order to support his family in reduced financial circumstances. Just as he was settling for a banking job, he had an unexpected visit from a Jesuit priest who invited the Cornelius to join them in Grand Coteau, Louisiana, where the Jesuits were opening a college for boys, not far from the girls' college run there by the Religious of the Sacred Heart. After a lot of soul-searching, Pierce and Cornelia accepted his offer and once again packed up their belongings and headed downriver to a very remote area in south-central Louisiana, about 2 hours west of New Orleans. It was frontier country, simple and remote, and they expected life to be challenging there, and it turned out to be.
Grand Coteau was not like any other place the Conleys had lived during their 7 years of married life. Geographically, south central Louisiana is flat and swampy, with many waterways called bayous. The climate is humid, very hot in summer and mild in winter, semi-tropical, with Spanish moss growing on most of the trees. It was a remote place, and even today there's very little to see or do there. If you walk in one direction, you arrive at the Sacred Heart Academy where Cornelia taught music. And if you go in the opposite direction, you reach St. Charles College, the Jesuit-run school where Pierce taught. A dirt pathway runs for about a mile between the two properties, and the Connolly cottage was somewhere in between.
For their first 9 months, the family lived in close quarters in a rustic cabin. Their days were full of routine: morning mass, caring for the children, household chores, teaching, fun and games at night, and evening prayer as a family. We have a quotation from one of Pierce's letters telling of the laughter in the house in the evenings when Cornelia sat down to play the piano and the children marched and danced around the house. Cornelia became pregnant with their 4th child. She also began to teach drawing as well as music at Sacred Heart Academy. She was the main earner in the family because Pierce was paid in free tuition for Myrtie at St. Charles. Pierce struggled with his work at the college. He thought the students were backward and uncultured, and even wrote to the head of the Jesuits to complain about them. But for the time being, he was quiet about priesthood.
In July 1839, a baby girl was born, Mary Magdalene, but she lived for only 7 weeks, a great sorrow for Cornelia. In 1839, just before Christmas, both Pierce and Cornelia made a 3-day retreat, he with the Jesuits and she with the Sacred Heart Sisters. Afterwards, Cornelia always said this was a life-changing experience for her. She called it a retreat of conversion, which shaped her for the rest of her life. She came out of it wanting to give herself all to God. It seemed as if everything was going wonderfully. But there's an entry in Cornelia's journal at this time that suggests that she was struggling with something. Her biographers believe that Pierce must have made some mention of his continuing desire for ordination, and this stirred new anxiety and dread in Cornelia. Even so, she also records a sense of great happiness and openness to God at this time, a readiness for whatever might be asked of her.
And then on January 31st, a terrible accident. On a warm winter's day, the children were outdoors running and playing with a big dog. A large, low container of boiling hot maple syrup had been set out to cool in the breeze. And in the flash of an eye, a tragedy. 2-year-old John Henry was hopelessly burned. Cornelia always called him the delight of my heart. She took him home in her arms and held him there until he died 43 hours later on February 2nd, a day which the Catholic liturgical calendar has called the Purification. For Cornelia, this was one of those experiences that are so deep and so layered that it's really impossible to describe them adequately. And it took her to new places in her relationship with Christ and his mother Mary. Michelangelo's sculpture of the Pietà, Mary holding her lifeless son, had new significance for her from this point on. Nevertheless, at Grand Coteau, ordinary life went on. And by June of that year, Cornelia was pregnant again, but all was not well. In fact, we have a letter that Pierce wrote at this very time to one of the friends he had made in Europe. He refers to himself and Cornelia as exiles, and he seems to be wishing for a more exciting, more influential life. At the same time, he boasts that he has one of the loveliest families the earth bears in its bosom. He's very conflicted, and he alternates between loneliness, discontent, and ecstatic love for his family. But he wants to be back in Rome and England, engaged in meaningful work. So Pierce has his eye on Europe just before he begins his retreat in October 1840. He began his retreat on October 9th and lived at St. Charles College, directed by one of the Jesuits. Cornelia was at home with the children, and we know that she and Pierce did meet on October 13th after Mass. Pierce told her he had decided to seek ordination in the Catholic Church, and he asked for her cooperation. Later, she wrote down exactly what he had said to her. She wrote, "It was his declared wish and intention to take holy orders in the Roman Catholic Church." And she wrote that she said to him, "This is a very grave matter. Think about it deeply and twice over. But if the good God asks the sacrifice, I am prepared to make it, and with all my heart." Much later, Cornelia told her early biographer that October 13th, 1840, the feast of St. Edward, was the beginning of the Society of the Holy Child Jesus, and that it was founded on a breaking heart.
And then life went on. The relationship between Pierce and Cornelia had changed radically, but the daily routine was the same. School was in session. Cornelia was pregnant with Frank, who was born in March 1841. She was also deeply engaged in her own discernment and made a retreat in January 1841. She seemed to be convinced that only a miracle would stop Pierce from pursuing his dream, and she wrote that they must work out their calling. Gradually, she reached a decision to cooperate with what Pierce was asking of her, and this gave him the freedom he wanted to make his petition for ordination to the Pope. Pierce moved immediately into action as soon as he had his agreement from Cornelia. He resigned from his teaching position at St. Charles College. They sold their house. Pierce decided to go ahead of the rest of the family to Rome, taking 9-year-old Myrtie with him. Cornelia, Frank, and Addie moved to the grounds of the Sacred Heart Academy and remained there for more than a year while Pierce traveled around Europe. Finally, she and the children left Grand Cateau when she learned that the Pope had told Pierce that he would not receive his petition until Cornelia could be present with him. So, Pierce returned to Grand Cateau to get them, and all together they sailed to Rome again from New York.
Let's step back from the details of that extraordinary story and pay attention to the chronology of events from 1831 to 1843. First of all, look at the big picture of Cornelia's adult years. From their marriage in 1831 in Philadelphia to their departure from Grand Cateau in 1843 is 12 years. They were married 12 years. In that time, they gave birth to 5 children and lost 2 of them. They converted to Catholicism. They made 5 major moves requiring them to pack up or leave behind everything. They were admired and respected and made friends in all those places.
Another video about the second half of Cornelia's life from the ages of 35 to 70 reveals her founding the Society of the Holy Child Jesus in England, the sisters' immigration journeys to the Americas and Africa, and Cornelia's legacy that the Law Center embraces. In conclusion, reflect on these questions and discuss them with others in the Casa Cornelia community. What thoughts do you have about Cornelia as a person? What about Cornelia's life and choices thus far impacts the mission and values of Casa Cornelia Law Center?